Hey guys, welcome to lesson 113. Today we are going to talk about domain and range and also do a little bit of a refresher on what we did yesterday, which was the key points of a graph. So we're just going to go ahead and get started with this graph over here. I have provided the graph this time because our focus is no longer making the graph. I just really want to focus on these key points right now. So for starters, x-intercepts. Remember that x-intercepts are the points on the graph which go through or touch the x-axis. Okay, and this horizontal line, that is our x-axis, and the vertical one is our y-axis. Okay, so our x-intercept, we only have one of them in this graph, is going to be right over here because that's the point on the graph that goes through this thick black line. Okay, so for our answer, we will write 5, 0 because that's the coordinates of that point. All right, next we have y-intercepts. So similarly to x-intercepts, right, we're looking for a point that goes through the axis, but this time it's the y-axis. So that's going to be this point right over here. Right, this is the point on the graph that goes through this thick black line, and that is 0, -1. Okay, and remember, x-intercepts always have a 0 in the y spot, and the y-intercepts always have a 0 in the x spot. All right, so the minimum, remember that the minimum is always low points of a graph, right? The lowest point. And so we can see that this graph, it's very similar to one we did yesterday. It doesn't go lower than this right over here. This is the lowest it gets. And so that is the point we're going to be using for our minimum. And if we look at the marks on the graph, we know this is at -4 because it goes 4 to the left, and then -3 because it goes 3 down. So we've got -4, -3. Okay, and that's going to be our minimum. Now, for our maximum, keep in mind that anytime your graph goes off the screen like this and there's no ending point, you can imagine there to be an arrow here. And that means that this graph is going to go on forever and ever. It's never going to stop. So, because it's going to keep getting higher and higher, we don't have a maximum. All right, so next up is domain and range. Now, there are two ways you can write domain and range, and MyOpenMath might ask you for either one. So it's really important that you understand both formats. So the first one we're going to talk about is domain. Now, domain has to do with x values. Okay, and what I mean by that is that it deals with left and right values. Okay, so basically, domain talks about what's the farthest left that our graph goes and what's the farthest right our graph goes. And if we look up here, we're like, okay, the graph doesn't go any further left past this dot or this point, right? And this occurs at this x value right here, right? So that is -4. And so we know that our bounds will start at -4 for the smallest. And then remember what we said about the graph going on forever and ever. Because it goes on forever and ever, there is no maximum, right? And so it's going to be infinity. It's going to go all the way to infinity. Now, infinity is not something that you can actually reach, but it's just something we say if a graph is going on forever and ever. Now, the last piece that's important about interval notation is that you need to put brackets or parentheses. For the -4, since -4 is actually, this is actually a valid point on the graph, we're going to put a bracket, okay? But infinity, because we can't ever reach infinity, we're going to put a parenthesis, okay? And then just as a little notes to take here, right? Brackets mean that those are valid parts of the graph. They can be reached. Okay, like -4 is actually a part on the graph. whereas the parentheses mean you cannot reach that value. And typically, like for the most part, we'll just use parentheses with infinities. There are circumstances where you do it with other stuff, but for now, it's for infinities. All right, so for inequality notation, this is just another way to represent the same thing. So we know that we're talking about x values here, and it's nice to think about inequality notation as what can x be in between, okay? So what's the lowest x can get, and what's the highest x can get? Now we know that all of the x values of this graph have to be like bigger than -4, right? Because this is the smallest we get. Everything else is farther to the right and bigger. So we can just pull this number down right over here for the left bound, okay? And then we know that x is going to go on forever and ever till infinity. So we're going to say that we can put an infinity here. So basically this is telling us that we have all x values between -4 and infinity. One last thing we need to do is, because there's a bracket here, right, because it's a real point, we know that we can also be equal to -4. So we have to put that bar down here. That represents like half an equal sign. So that tells us that we are allowed to have an x value of -4. All right, so now for range. Range is kind of the opposite of domain in that this time we're talking about y values. And so this is talking about how low or how high the graph can go, okay? Or you can say up, down, either one, okay? So for us, in this graph, the lowest y value, now remember, this time we're working on y values. And because this is the lowest point of our graph, we take the y value of it, which is -3. Okay, so we know that our interval is going to start at -3, and we'll put a bracket because it's a real point on the graph. And again, because this graph is going higher and higher forever, we're going to put infinity, because not only is it going to the right forever, but it's also going in the upwards direction forever. All right, and then for inequality notation, we can use the same exact values, just replace x with y, because now we're using y. All right, so that is all for this graph. We're going to go ahead and do one more graph. It's going to be a parabola this time. So now the key points for the parabola are x-intercepts. Remember, those are points on the x-axis. So that's these guys right over here. Sometimes there's 1, sometimes there's 2. It all just depends. So that's at 1, 0, this one right over there. And this one is at 3, 0. Okay. For y-intercepts, that's going to be the part of the graph that touches the vertical axis. So that's going to be this point right over here. And that's at 0, -3, because it goes down 1, 2, 3 places. Okay, now for minimum, notice how this graph goes downwards forever, and it just goes off the screen, right? This means we can act like there are arrows, and that means it goes on forever and ever and ever. It'll just keep getting smaller and smaller. So there is no minimum this time. Okay, this time we actually have a maximum, because the highest this graph will ever go is right here at that point. And that point is at 2, 2, right? Because we go right to, oh, sorry, it's actually 2, 1. There we go. And that's our max. All right. And typically on parabolas, the vertex is always going to be either the minimum or the maximum, depending on if it's upside down or not. All right, so now for domain and range. Now, with a parabola, notice how it's going, like this left side's pointing to the left, this side's pointing to the right, and it's going to go on forever and ever. So that means that it'll keep going on in both directions forever. So we have no left bound, really, so we'll use negative infinity to talk about the left direction. okay, because left is always about like the negative numbers. And then in the right side, it goes on forever too. So we'll use a positive infinity for the right side. That's definitely supposed to be here. All right. I'm not going to rewrite the definitions, or I guess I can. All right. And then for inequalities, you just use those same numbers. And there's no equal to bars because we don't have any brackets. Now for range, okay, remember y values, high, low. We go down forever and ever. So the lowest our graph will get is actually negative infinity because it'll never stop, right? And this thing has downward pointing arrows. So it's just going to get lower and lower forever. Now the highest point of this graph is right over here. And remember, we're working with y values. So the highest we'll ever get is right here. And that is a y value of 1. Okay, oops. And so that point we use for our interval. And because it's a real point, we'll put a bracket there. And for the inequality, again, just take the same values from the interval notation. And remember, because there's a bracket by the 1, we're going to put an equal sign next to the 1. Now, Now, if you feel like you're a little lost on this, it's okay. Please ask questions. Students typically do struggle with domain and range. So if you are having a little trouble understanding, don't feel ashamed. Please be sure to come back to the Zoom call and ask questions. That's all for today. See ya.